vote in an election, what are you really doing? This question's important if you want to understand the workings of democracy. After all, voting's a critical piece of the whole democratic process. And this is true whatever the other details, whether you're voting directly on policies or candidates, whether voting's compulsory, as it is in Australia, where I'm from, or optional, as in America, whether the election is at the national or state or local level, and so on. Elections are an absolutely indispensable part of the democratic process. So it seems pretty important to understand what voting really amounts to. It's tempting to think that when people vote, they're choosing the electoral outcome, choosing who's to be president, say. And of course, the winner of any election is indeed the candidate who gets the most votes. The voting process does determine the outcome. But I was careful to ask you earlier, what do you do when you vote? And the answer surely can't be that you individually choose the winner. In fact, the way in which you vote determines the outcome only in one very remote case, namely when there's an exact tie among all other voters. And the probability of that outcome in an election involving more than, say, 100 million voters is very, very small indeed. To see what this means, just imagine that when you go to the polls, you make a terrible mistake and vote for the wrong candidate. Does this mean that the wrong candidate will win? Almost certainly not. You can rest easy. The probability that your mistake will make a difference to the outcome is so small as to be negligible. Even if the result is incredibly tight, and the result in your state comes down to, say, just 2 votes, the leading candidate will win anyway, however you vote. Unless there's an exact tie among all the others, your mistake will be irrelevant to who wins. And this is the case for all individual voters. Each is involved in an exercise where her individual vote is almost certain to be irrelevant for the outcome. This is very different from making a choice in the marketplace. When you choose in the marketplace between apples and oranges or buying a Corvette or a Mustang, you're decisive over the options. You get whatever you choose. As economists would put it, the opportunity cost of the Mustang is the Corvette foregone. But in the polling booth, the opportunity cost of a vote for candidate A is not candidate B foregone, it's just a vote for candidate B foregone. A single vote for candidate B and getting B as outcome are, in almost all cases, not the same thing. Early public choice theorists overlooked the important difference involved here. They made the simple observation that people who vote and the people who operate in the marketplace are the same people. And since people are in the marketplace, as we know, motivated significantly by their own interests, theorists extrapolated that self-interested behaviour to the voting setting. So they predicted that voters would vote strictly according to their interests, just as if they were choosing an assets portfolio. But this is to ignore the fact that the circumstances of choice behaviour are very different in the two settings. Consider the following simple hypothetical. There's a policy, a carbon reduction policy, say, that you conscientiously think you ought to support. You've read a bit of the science and you're convinced that carbon emissions are harming life on Earth. So you feel a moral obligation to support measures to significantly reduce America's carbon footprint. Unfortunately, this policy, if implemented, will cost you $10,000 a year in extra taxes and higher prices. How much would it cost you to vote for this policy, as your conscience requires? If you think the answer's $10,000 a year, think again, because that's not right. The correct answer is it'll cost you $10,000 a year times the probability that your vote will decide the outcome. And in a total voting population of 100 million or more, such as in the US presidential election, the probability of a tie is infinitesimally small, so the cost probably amounts to a few cents. This seems like really good news. It's cheap to vote morally. In fact, voters are much more likely to vote according to their consciences than they are to act according to their consciences in the normal arena of action. This is a very significant difference. But there is a sting in the tail here, because the same feature that makes it cheap to vote your conscience also makes it cheap to vote for the best-looking candidate, or the one with the nicest voice, or the one who just seems most attractive to you on other grounds, or the one who supports your prejudices. Voting is a bit like cheering at a basketball game. When the fans cheer and boo, they express an opinion about who they'd like to win, but they don't really believe that their cheering will determine the outcome of the game. When they cheer, they're expressing something about what they'd like to see happen. I say that voting's a bit like cheering, but the analogy isn't perfect. Basketball's not a cheering competition. Nevertheless, the critical feature is that each cheerer is expressing an attitude towards something over which she has negligible influence, just as in the voting case. Voting is much more like cheering than it is like choosing. One implication is that if you want to know what makes people vote in the way they do, ask what might make them cheer for one candidate rather than another. Of course, candidates know this. They try to induce you as a voter to cheer for them and to boo the alternatives. They work on your emotions. They press the right buttons. They play to your rage and your indignation and your sense of injustice and your fears. Of course, they can also play to your interests and your reason. But few people choose which basketball team to cheer for on the basis of interests or reason. To summarise, anyone who wants to understand the workings of democratic politics has to understand the nature of voting, the basic inputs into the democratic process. In this video, I've suggested three things. First, voting decisions are less likely than market decisions to be motivated by self-interest. Second, people are more likely to vote according to their conscience than act according to their conscience. Third, voting also allows scope for other, less exalted considerations, things like rage and fear and indignation. Democratic processes are always susceptible to the play of such emotions. What considerations predominate is partly a matter of the voters themselves, but it's also a matter of what limits candidates are prepared to impose on themselves in the scramble to get elected. One upshot of this is that individuals can perfectly rationally vote for outcomes that are not in their best interests, indeed are not really in the best interests of anyone. The likelihood that when aggregated these votes will reliably give rise to outcomes that are in the public interest, well, that's not impossible, but it does seem pretty unlikely.